Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Person You Want to Be. I am your host, Eric Teplitz. Today, I am honored to have as my guest, perhaps the planet's greatest friend to independent podcasts and podcasters, Alex Sanfilippo. Alex Sanfilippo's professional background includes stints in a real estate technology startup, real estate investing, 15 years of experience working in the aerospace industry, blogging, public speaking, and coaching. Currently, he is the CEO and founder of PodPros, a company that develops software solutions for independent podcasters and the guests who appear on their shows. His offerings include PodMatch, which matches podcast hosts with their ideal guests and vice versa, and Podcast SOP, software for podcasters to help them manage the workflow of each new episode they release. He knows what he's talking about with all this stuff, being an experienced podcaster himself, currently as host of the top-rated show, Podcasting Made Simple, with over 200 episodes published to date. Alex Sanfilippo, welcome to The Person You Want to Be.
Eric, thank you so much for that warm welcome. I really appreciate it, and I'm very honored to be here today.
Thank you so much. And 200 episodes, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's major.
Very excited about it. You know, it's when you're doing one a week, 200 might sound like a small number. When it's one a week, that's years. So I'm very excited about it.
Yeah, and it doesn't sound like a small number.
Okay, good. All right.
So I know that you started your first business at the precocious age of 10, and I'm definitely going to ask you about the specifics of that. But before we even do that, what I like to do on the show to get things started off is to ask you about your earliest memories or memory of whatever notion you had inside of you of who it was you felt you were or wanted to be or what you wanted to do, and whether this was something fantastical and very childlike or not. And also, if you could give us some context about the environment in which you were brought up, to answer that, I would love to hear your answer.
Yeah, sure. I love this question. And first off, I come from a family of entrepreneurs. So both my mom's side and my dad's side. Interestingly enough, my grandparents and my parents on both sides, they grew up very poor. I mean, both sides of the family. One was a family of 5, and the other one was, 6 and 7 was how many like siblings they had. And so they're big families. But they were extremely poor immigrants. My mom's side being Jewish, my dad's side being Italian. And for whatever, I don't know how this happened, but all the kids on both sides became extremely successful. Like there's not even an exception. Like all of them just crushed it. And so I'm very privileged to have grown up in a home that when I was a kid, they weren't necessarily doing well. They were just kind of getting their footing, if you will. But like I kind of grew up in a home that was continuously doing better and better and better. And I'm extremely thankful for that. I was just talking to my wife about that the other day, that like my childhood is something that I cherish. And because of that, I had a lot of time to play. I lived in nice neighborhoods that had other kids in them. So I didn't like grow up on the side of a highway or anything like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm very, again, privileged of growing up in neighborhoods that were very diverse, a lot of really cool people. But I learned so much about different cultures, just even as a kid, just by safely being in my neighborhood, which I'm very thankful for. My earliest thing that I wanted to be was a cowboy. I told my mom, this is one of my earliest memories too. I told my mom, you know what? When I get older, I'm going to move to Texas and I'm going to be a cowboy, and I'm probably going to be a sheriff or a deputy. And like, I knew this. My mom broke my heart when she said they also drive cars and have electricity in Texas. I was unable to connect those two things because I was watching this on TV and just assuming this is just what Texas is like, and that's where I'm going to go. Broke my heart. It took me years to recover and figure out what I wanted to be after that.
That's hilarious. I know you live in Jacksonville, Florida. Is that where you grew up as well, or?
Yeah. Born and raised. And it's land-wise, it's one of the biggest cities in the United States. And I've consistently, this is the way I put it, I've just moved closer and closer to the ocean the older I've gotten. My goal is to end up on the beach at some point. We'll see when I get there. But this is where I've been born, raised. I traveled around a little bit when I got out of high school. thinking maybe I'd move somewhere else, but I just realized I love this city.
Hmm.
It's actually a refugee hub. I think it's number 6 in the United States for the largest, but it's the most diverse. And I'm really a big fan of diversity. I have friends of all cultures and backgrounds, and I really love that. And I feel like not everywhere has that same offering. It feels like a lot of more similar people. And I love the way that people think when they're from different cultures and countries and backgrounds. And that's made this city very attractive for me to stay in.
Yeah, that's great. If you love it, why leave, right?
Exactly.
I'm so fascinated in how we become the people that we become, the people that we are and the people that we aspire to be, and all the different factors involved, all the different influences, everything from our genes to our environment that we're hopefully nurtured in, or in some cases not very nurtured in. And also, maybe even most importantly, the agency that we assume in our lives and the choices that we make, most especially those that are made consciously about directing ourselves into becoming who it is that we want to be. So it's very interesting to hear that you, and I guess really not surprising that you grew up in a family of entrepreneurs and you had all of these models of success as well. So I suppose at least in part that set the stage for your own entrepreneurial ventures. I know also you're the oldest of 4 and all boys. Is that right?
That's correct. Yep. 3 younger
Yeah.
brothers.
And I've heard you say elsewhere that you, by nature at least, were much more introverted than your younger brothers.
Yeah, by a long shot. Definitely. Especially growing up. Now that is completely shifted for whatever reason. But growing up, yeah, I was the more quiet, reserved one for sure.
How and when do you think you stepped into greater, for lack of a better word, extroversion? Because obviously so many of the things that you're doing now uh, require putting yourself out there and being very sociable.
Right. Like if I was to really pinpoint it, I'd say it was actually probably my late teen years after I got out of high school. Weirdly enough, and I'll mention this, and this may come up at some point anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and break the ice on it now. I was homeschooled throughout. I had a bit of a learning disability as a younger kid, and thank God for my mom who actually stopped doing her business and decided to homeschool. Without that, I don't know as I would have actually made it through high school. So I worked very hard and thankfully was able to overcome maybe the natural disadvantages I maybe had along the way. And we can get more into that. But when I was at home having my younger brothers, my dad was busy building a business. Like I said, like they weren't really successful when I was a kid, but they worked their way there. He was gone a lot, working all the time, traveling, stuff like that. And my mom coming home, who's used to being a business person herself, is now a mom and very quickly became a mom of 4. I believe I was just nothing against the culture I was brought up in, but I think it was almost kind of brought to, I need to be more quiet, reserved because I got to help take care of these guys. I got to work really hard and study. I can't really get out there as much. And I think that a lot of that being subconscious is just kind of the way I live my life. And when I graduated high school and realized like I'm free, more or less, school was a struggle for me all the way through. I think I really just started exploring more of who I was. And the more I got around people, the more I realized, man, I have so much more energy when I leave hanging out with people than when I got there, or than when I'm just sitting at home by myself. Because I just realized I didn't enjoy that. And I think it was me really discovering who I was, which maybe happened later than it does for some people, but it was really like a full shift. And my mom still this day brings it up. She's like, you were such a quiet, reserved kid. Like, what happened to you? You know, now you're like the loudest one in the room. And it's not me putting on any sort of front or anything like this. I just know that this is the person I want to be. This is who I believe I was made to be. And I'm fully operating in that now. I hope that kind of answers the question there. I don't know if I took that wrong.
Yeah, no, it's a great answer. And by the way, I'm 50 and I'm still figuring out who it is and who the person I want to be is. I think it's an ongoing journey. But what's so interesting about your answer is that by definition, and I think people get these terms confused sometimes, introversion versus extroversion, or introvert versus extrovert. Most humans fall on a spectrum of this. No one is completely, we shouldn't say no one, always need to allow for those extreme exceptions, those anomalies, but most of us are somewhere along the line of that spectrum. And I think it can shift. There's a range where we lean maybe more in one direction or the other. But the thing that's interesting is, by definition, what it has to do with is where you get your energy from. So introverts, in order to recharge their batteries, need solitude. And extroverts, they get their batteries charged by being around other people. So it's not necessarily a function of how outgoing you are or aren't. It's where and how you get your kind of batteries charged determines, that kind of definition of introvert versus extrovert. And these are labels and they can be problematic. But what I find so interesting though is that it sounds like, by that definition, that you were actually charged and energized by social interaction, and it just maybe wasn't given the opportunity to make itself known until you finished high school. Would you say that sounds, I don't know, how does that sound to you?
Yeah, no, that sounds right. I mean, that's when I was really able to flourish in it, if you will. And I obviously I had again a ton of friends in the neighborhood. I had my younger brothers, right? So like I had all that. And I think maybe I just had a little bit of a weight of, hey, I'm here to help. Like it felt like, let's put it this way, my high school years specifically felt like the hardest work I've ever had to do in my life. Like if I look back at it, like not just from a schooling standpoint, but also helping out, like my family, like I said, they're doing very well. At that point, they were still building. And I felt like I had something to contribute as the oldest, helping take care of my younger brothers and stuff like that as well. And yeah, I just think it kind of, after high school is when it really started to flourish. And I came like full term on that, right? Like, and really just stepped into it more and more, and kind of had like a weight lifted that didn't feel, I don't look back and have any bad memories of it. I mean, obviously I'll still tell you, no, I did not enjoy school, but I don't look at it as like it helped me build up some self-discipline and get me through some tough things. But I don't look back at it as negatively. I just look at it as like, I was in some way, I needed to be a certain way. And then I was able to be kind of freed after that.
Yeah, I think most people can probably relate in some fashion to the feeling of needing to be a certain way in order to, meet the needs of the environment they're in, whether that happens to be their home environment or their work environment. And to some extent, it involves suppressing maybe your natural personality or interests or desires so that you can manage in that safely and navigate that environment. Were all of your brothers homeschooled as well?
They were. Yeah. I don't know how I wasn't involved in that conversation between my mom and dad, but after it was decided I would be homeschooled. The rest of them just kind of fell in line. I don't know if that was something they're just like, you know what, let's just go all in, right? Or if it was more than that. But yeah, all four of us were homeschooled. We all played city league sports, and we all had teachers that would come in to the home for specific, like my mom isn't some genius, especially when it comes to math. That was her worst subject. And she'll still admit that. We had a math tutor that would come in that could kind of handle all the levels, if you will. So we kind of had, and we went to a couple different schools for like certain subjects just because that was easy for us to do. But yeah, we were technically all homeschooled.
Very interesting. So, okay, let's then talk about the age of 10 and your first business. What happened? How did this come about?
Well, obviously my mom, like bringing the whole full circle conversation here, my mom crushed my dreams of becoming a cowboy, as I mentioned. So I had that happen. No, you know what? It was interesting. At the age of 10, I definitely had a lot of awareness, like self-awareness of who I was, which anyone who's listening to this might be like, wow, this guy sounds weird. And maybe I was, who knows? But I realized even at that age that I wasn't good at a lot of things that other kids in the neighborhood were, or that my brothers were. Example, like we've already been through this. I wasn't great at school. Like that was very difficult for me. I had friends in the neighborhood that wouldn't even try in the beginning straight A's. Like they would just crush it. Right. I'm like, man, how? My brothers were all very good musicians. I can't clap on beat. Right. Like, it's like, that's weird. And then I was also not good at video games, but I also wasn't good at sports. And I'm telling you what, if you're not good at one or the other, there's a real problem there. So I just kind of realized even at that young age, I'm like, it didn't necessarily get me down. I just remember realizing, you know what, I'm not good at any of these things that people are good at. And I wasn't beating myself up, and I still had fun doing all those things except for school. But I realized that like, this just isn't it. And I'll never forget it. One day I was on the golf course, which was across the street from our neighborhood. We were told, don't go play on the golf course. So obviously the entire neighborhood kids all go together to play on the golf course. That's what you do. And so we're on the golf course, and one day there was a golf ball sitting there. I picked it up and I was just kind of holding it, 10 years old, and a golfer rides by in a cart, and he yells at me. He goes, "Hey kid, what does that golf ball say on it?" Turned around and said, "Titleist Pro V1. And he just goes, "I'll give you $3 for it." And I gave him the ball. He gave me $3. And the first ever light bulb went off in my head that was like, oh my gosh, I watch golfers hit balls in the water every single day. And if we can get those, they'll give me $3 for each of them. At least that was my thought at that point. And interestingly enough, I found the first thing that I realized I was really good at, which happened to be this idea of business or entrepreneurship or building a system even, because immediately I grabbed the kids who were with me, which were a couple of my brothers, one of my neighbors, right? I was like, here's the deal. You two go find out if our parents can get us one of these ball retrievers we see people with. The rest of us, let's start digging around the lakes. Hey, when we find them, you're going to go clean them. We're going to categorize them, and then we're going to sell them out here Saturday morning when we're not doing school. So in the evenings, we went out and looked around, and we set up a little shop. It was the 7th tee box in this little country club golf course. And other kids were selling lemonade, making, I don't know, a few dollars a day on a Saturday. And we were bringing a couple $100 every Saturday morning as a group of 4 people. And we just built this system. And again, for the first time, I realized I'm good at this and I enjoy this. Now that lasted 2 years. It was from 10 to 12. After 12, you're not really cute anymore. So when someone sees a golf ball with their initials on it, that you like, kid, give me that golf ball back, right? Truth be told, somebody actually bought us out. By the time I probably wasn't even 12 yet, but somebody came by and they're like, I really like this collection. I want to buy all of these. And they said, if you set up shop, I'll come buy them out at the end of the day. And they did. So they bought everything, including all the cases we kept in, the cleaning stuff. I think they wanted the business for their kid, was secretly what it was. But that was kind of our retirement, if you will. And it lasted like a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And that was, again, a really fun experience for me.
What a great story. There's another thing that stands out to me when you described you noticed you were good at something, that this was something that you were good at. You had some excitement about, but also some ability to execute, right? And it included being organized for sure, and having a systems kind of mentality, which I have seen how much that exists now in what you do. I'm very impressed with your organizational know-how and your systems approach to things, which really, specifically in the field of podcasting, and the way that you have outlined systems for podcasters to help them manage the many overwhelming tasks involved in putting together an episode and getting a workflow and a system so that you can be consistent about your publishing, which is a huge deal for podcasters. But I'm digressing a little bit. But the thing that pops out to me in that story, the quality that is just so salient to me, is this leadership quality. How many kids would just assume the role of leader and start directing people and delegating? That part is really fascinating. How did you get everybody on board, and why do you think that they, went along with it?
In that moment, it was probably because I was the kid holding the $3. But realistically, it was because I immediately took charge without meaning to. And let's put it this way. Even as a kid, I was never the one that was like an oppressive leader. Sometimes as a kid, like, we're doing this because I said so. Like, it was never that way. It was just like, hey guys, this is a good idea. Let's do it. And it came naturally. I don't even know how to describe, especially a 10-year-old. I can't dissect the 10-year-old version myself and really come up with anything that's coherently visible at this point, other than the fact that, that was just something inside of me, and it just came out.
Right. It was given an opportunity. Yeah. To kind of.
It's a good way to
shine.
say it. I like that.
So I've also heard you say elsewhere in describing your homeschooling that you were fortunate enough to have gotten some instruction in finances and things relative to maybe not just business, but even personal finances, because this is something that is sorely missing in a lot of public school education, just sort of very real life, practical kind of skills. And it sounds like you were given those things and didn't realize that other kids didn't learn this stuff, right?
Yes. When I married my wife, we were talking, and I was talking about like, oh man, I remember when I was like 13 or whatever, however old I was, and I was learning to balance a checkbook and to manage a budget and stuff like that. She's like, what? I was like, what do you mean what? Didn't you learn that in school? She's like, no. I'm like, how are you supposed to know how to do it after school? She's like, make a ton of mistakes and get in debt. I was like, well, what the heck? So that really like threw me through a loop, but apparently that just wasn't there. And for me, again, my mom is a saint. So thankful for that lady. She took a very practical approach to a lot of these things. So she made sure we could get credit for the work being done, but instead of just all these hypothetical situations, she's like, hey, let's make it this real life. Here is what our checkbook look, back then it was a checkbook. Here is how you balance that, right? Here's how you make sure you spend less money than you make, right? Like all those type of things. It was just worked into what we did. And call me naive or whatever, but I just assumed that's what people were doing in public school as well. But I learned to live an adult life throughout my high school education specifically. I mean, I shouldn't say that, through all of my education, I learned how to be a functioning adult. So when I was done, I didn't get into my own home and was like, oh no, what do? I got to learn all this stuff. No, it was like, I've been doing this and practicing for years. Like, I'm ready to go. And I really believe that I've always been very good with money. Like, I might not make a ton of it all the time, but I'm good at managing what I have and stretching that and using it to serve others as well. And that's just something that I would say my education taught me.
So you had some clear advantages being homeschooled and getting some foundational adulting skills that many of us did not. Do you think there were any disadvantages that you finished high school, entering the quote unquote real world with?
Yeah, and there's probably a handful of them. The first I can think of is, although we played city league sports, had a lot of neighborhood friends and things like that, I probably didn't have the exposure to big groups of people that others would, which makes sense. There was no town hall meeting or anything like that, right? It was always just a few of us around and things like that. So there was no it wasn't as big. Let's put it that way. And maybe initially that probably slowed me down a little bit. The first few times I remember getting huge groups, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of people, but then I realized I loved it, but I just didn't know that. That was probably one of the disadvantages. The other thing is maybe a little bit of, which I don't actually I don't feel like I missed anything, but some people might say some of the childhood. Like, some people talk about their high school years being the best years of their life. Again, for me, that was kind of a struggle. It wasn't bad. I have nothing but fond memories, but I maybe missed out on the social fun aspect of it. As far as every day being with your friends all day and stuff like that. And again, for me, I'm thinking, seeing all my friends in a painful environment, that doesn't sound great, yeah. I'm gonna go to prison to hang out with all my friends.
Exactly.
But again, those are probably a couple of things that I would say would have been the disadvantage. Aside from that, just the anxiety, and this was probably due to some learning disability on the way, but the anxiety that came with being in front of a boardroom, which came way later, actually presenting to a board, that stuff terrified me at first, really terrified me. And it's probably because I never presented in front of a class. I presented in front of my mom or a teacher, right?
Sure, maybe, but I can say that many people who have gone through conventional schooling are equally terrified of public speaking, right? It's notably ranked as the #1 fear above death,
right?
When in polls, anytime you look at a survey of what are people afraid of. So I think it's a fairly common thing, even if for people who were not homeschooled per se. So you had this early experience as a youngster with having a successful business. And it sounds like, from what I've heard you say elsewhere, this was kind of a light bulb moment for you in embracing the idea of having a business, being an entrepreneur. So when you finished high school and it became time to figure out what to do next, were there any expectations, perhaps that your family had for you, your peers had for you? What were the expectations that were maybe thrust upon you, but also what did you decide, or what did you think you wanted to do at that point?
Yeah, these are some deep questions here. I'm excited to dive into these. First off, I think my friends, because that's when I really started, if you will, really coming into my own as far as an extrovert is concerned. So I think my friends thought I was gonna be this super fun party guy. I never really went through any party phase. Let's put it that way. I like to think I was super fun, but not a party guy. So I wasn't yeah, let's go to that wild party and get crazy. I'm now let's go back in the woods and build a fire and hang out. That was more my pace, if you will. So from that regard, I'm not sure what the friends' expectation was. My parents didn't really have any, at least that were voiced, and I actually really appreciate that about them. There was never a time where Alex, we really expect this of you, or we really want to see you do that. That, other than we want to see you graduate high school, right? That was the one ask that they had. They never really had anything else. I'm thankful for that, because it kind of gave me that openness. I will say, during high school, sure, the golf ball thing happened. I had a couple other things along the way. I loved flipping things on eBay. Back then, eBay was big. And I realized that, if you buy this, you can flip it. Or at one point, I bought a bunch of wallets that I knew everyone would want at one of my buddy's schools. So I was like, yo, man, you're my distributor. I'm going to buy all these wallets. You're going to go sell them. I bought a bunch of Coach purses one time, because apparently girls freaked out over those things. I made a ton of money there, right? All those little things I did along the way. So I knew it was me something entrepreneurial. And right when I could, as soon as I could, I invested in real estate, because I realized that was true passive income. I could do some rentals. That was going to be sweet. So I invested in a property as soon as I possibly could. 6 months later, the economy totally tanked. So I went from being like, I'm out of high school, I'm ready to crush it. I have real estate. I'm probably the youngest person around who has real estate, and I am doing really well, to, oh my gosh, I'm so far in debt, I'm never going to get out of this. And that happened virtually within a 6-month period of time. And because of that, I talked to my dad, who, again, entrepreneur. And at this point, he was like kind of a legend in the below the atmosphere aerospace industry. I was like, hey, Dad, how's that industry doing? Because real estate is terrible. And he's like, oh, it's good. Like, as long as you stay in like this sector, you're fine. And I was like, any chance you can help me get a job in that space? And he's like, I can get you an introduction. You can apply, all that. Right. So I like to think that I got a part-time job because of him. But basically, I don't know how old I was at this point. I couldn't tell you the exact age here, but I got into corporate. And so I went from like entrepreneur mindset to stepping into corporate. And that was my real first step into like structured business, if you will.
Okay. So first explain to me this term below the atmosphere, because I didn't understand what you meant by that.
Yeah. Well, whenever I mentioned that was in aerospace, people assume I'm a skydiver, an astronaut, or a fighter pilot. So when I say below the atmosphere, it simply means I'm not going to
below
space.
the atmosphere.
Yeah,
okay. Yes. Okay.
So we focused on like
below the radar, like the
exactly
the less glamorous side.
And I'll be real, I worked at a company that manufactured parts, and when I got started, I was a part-time receiving clerk, which means I broke down boxes and took out people's trash. And I worked my way up over the years, but I never did anything besides work behind a computer or play with parts, right? So it was nothing crazy. I want everyone to understand that. I'm not like, I don't have some like crazy stories we're about to get into here. Sorry to disappoint everybody.
I love your story so far, Alex. There's nothing disappointing. So the way you describe this, what I'm not hearing is any, you have this experience pretty early on of you're boldly investing in real estate. Your timing is terrible. The market crashes. You find yourself in debt. You ask your dad for help in the form of, can you get me, a job? And it sounds like the way you tell it, you were happy to have the entry-level position doing what you were doing as a receiving clerk. Was this a blow to your ego at the time? What was the emotional, color of your experience at that stage?
It was definitely a blow to my ego. Like, I've been sharing very, very high level to get down to the nitty gritty at this point. When I started investing in real estate, I also started, this was probably, I'd say my first, I'm doing air quotes here, serious relationship, as serious as it can be for 17 or 18 years old, right? But I was doing really well, and find out later this girl was attracted to me because I was doing very well. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the type of person I started getting around, was other people that were more of like, man, this guy's going to crush it. My dream was to be a Forbes 30 under 30. Like I saw a magazine one day, I think it was at the dentist, and I was like, I want that to be me. Real estate's going to be my vehicle. I've got the girl, I've got the car, right? And I'm really young, I'm going for it. And so when that happened, interestingly enough, a lot of those friends kind of disappear. So does the girl, right? And the car needs to be traded in for something else. Like, all that stuff happens. It was a major blow to my ego, but I think an absolute necessity at the same time. It was a necessity for me to become the man that I needed to be. Now, like, I'm wearing a shirt right now, it says the words lead with value. To learn to lead with value instead of profits as the first thought that comes to my mind required me to go through an ego damaging time. And yeah, I'll be real, like, going from the guy who's like, man, I got the girl, I got the car, I got the rental property, like, I'm not even gonna have to work for the rest of my life, basically. I'm imagining, obviously we know more now, but at that age, I was like, yeah, I got it all. Going from that to saying, yeah, I'll take out your trash, yeah, I'll break down those boxes, I'll get to it. That took a lot. I'm thankful for it, but yes, it really did take a big hit on me.
What do you think was you kind of alluded to this, but what do you think was motivating to you at that, was motivating you and driving you at that young age? Were you looking at all of the shiny things and wanting to kind of have this outward appearance of success? Like, what did success mean to you, do you think, as a late teens, early 20 something?
I really couldn't define it back then. I even think back to think if I subconsciously knew, I think I had no idea. As soon as I got out of school, I think I was just so excited to legitimately feel like I was free that I was like, man, I'm going to go after everything, right? Like, I don't think I had a really strategic plan. And I am a very strategic person. Systems, processes are in my DNA at this point. But at that point in my life, I think I was just like, here's the thing. If you have a dog that is only good on a leash, but it knows it's off a leash as soon as you let it off and it just takes off, that was how I would describe myself. So it's like when the dog gets out the front door and it's like, you can't catch me. And I was just running everywhere. And I don't doubt that at one point or another, if real estate wasn't my my vehicle, I don't doubt that I would have crashed and burned no matter what, because I was running so aimlessly at that point. So to answer your question, Eric, like completely indirectly, I don't think I had a plan or a purpose at that point. I was just going for it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you swallow your pride, you take the job, and you end up staying in the field. I don't know if you were at the same company all that time, but you were, right? For 15 years, is that right?
15 years at the same company.
So what was your journey like there, both in terms of your growth within the company, because I know you ultimately became an executive before you left.
Yep.
So this is like a multi-part question. You can tackle it in whatever order you want. But what I'm interested in, we're talking about this 15-year chapter of your life. And, you grow into this position in the corporate world. I'm guessing that you meet your wife during this time, but I want to hear the story behind that. And also, what happened to your entrepreneurial aspirations during the course of that 15-year arc?
Yeah. So first off, when I got into this, like I said, I was kind of broken at that point. And well, again, the years are fuzzy. I'm 34 now. They shouldn't be fuzzy, but they are for some reason. So forgive me for not knowing exact timelines here. But at this point, I remember I ended up moving into that rental property because I legitimately couldn't afford anything else at that point. That was my only decision. So I lived in it, had a roommate, and was working this job. And I remember being there, and one day, this was kind of like the shift for me. This happened around the time that I started working this job, that I got something in the mail, because we used to get stuff in the mail that we'd actually look at. So I got like a flyer, and it was for a church. It was a young adult ministry. And I remember seeing it and looking at the address and knowing, I'm like, that's like, I could probably walk to wherever this is, like this is right around me. And so I remember just going. I grew up in church, but I never gave it much thought. And it's, it's like that. Like when you're brought up in something, you sometimes just don't think about it. So it was one of those things. And I stopped as soon as I became adult. I was just like, I'm not really going to go do that anymore. And I saw this. So after a couple of year break, I was like, what the heck? I could do Bible trivia. I'm ready to go. Let's see what we got here. So I remember going there, and I walked in with that same mindset of my ego crushed. So a defeated young man at this point. And knowing that someone was going to ask me what I do, and I was going to have to give an account for my life, more or less, right? Like this was my mindset. Regardless, I sucked it up. I walked in the door, and I found a group of people that really liked me for who I was and didn't care where I'd been, what I had done. And I remember thinking back to, I shared with you earlier, like the friends and the girl, like they disappear, right? Like when things change and get tough. These people weren't like that. And I fully embraced it. And I was like, you know what? Like I remember my upbringing being really good. I had my church friends as well. And I think I want to dive into this. And so I just went all in, and I really owe everything about where I am, where I'm heading, all that to my relationship with Jesus. I know for some people, that's a really strange thing to hear. So we don't necessarily need to dive into that. But for me, that's the foundation of everything. So bringing that back to the aerospace job, when I was there and humbled myself, and I decided to just use the entrepreneurial side of my mind in a corporate business. I think there's actually a coined term now. I think it's intrapreneur. Do you know if that's what it is, Eric?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
You basically act within the context of a company, but you apply entrepreneurial skills and kind of that mindset, but within the confines of a job rather than your own business.
It's a good definition. Thank you. Yeah. So more or less, I started acting that way. An example, like when you're like, well, Alex, how do you do that as a part-time receiving clerk? That's code for breaking down boxes and taking out trash. I realized there was multiple areas that boxes were being broken down every day. And there's piles that where people should be walking, because that's just where they were opening them up. So I immediately said, hey, we've got carts. We're going to wheel them all to the same place. And I'm going to break them down one time a day, all in the same section. Hey, this trash can's getting emptied 3 times a day. Here's a bigger trash can. I'll go move the smaller one because no one's using this over here anyway. So we'll just put it over here. And little things like that get noticed in an organization. When someone walks by who's an executive, sees that, and they're like, dang, this guy, like, he's barely making any money. He's barely getting any hours, but he's like taking bigger initiative than people that should be thinking. You get promoted to full time really quick. And then if you continue to apply that sort of mindset in business, there's, it's Liz Wiseman is her name. She coined the term impact player, which is basically this idea. And that's a really good book, by the way, Impact Players by Liz Wiseman. I highly recommend it. And more or less, if you pick up that book, she talks about the traits of somebody who really drives an organization forward. And I believe I just had those naturally as this entrepreneur. So I worked my way up. And this was started as a small company, if you will. I say small, it was a multi-million-dollar company, but it ended up, by the time I left, it was a multi-billion-dollar publicly traded company. and it had a buyout throughout that, and I was involved in all that. So like my experience over that 15 years is insane. Like it's just wild, the amount of like things that people are like, wow, you did that. It was interesting. Now I'm full-time podcasting. That one company was 3 times the size of the entire podcast industry. That gives you an idea of like the size of like how small what we do is, right? Like, I'm like, that's a little humbling to disappear and jump into a smaller industry. But anyway, to kind of summarize all this and sum it up, the last thing you asked about was my wife. I did meet her during this time. It was a few years after I got involved in church. We just had the opportunity to meet. We didn't date for a couple of years, but after that, we ended up dating and getting married. And as we're recording this, we've been married just over 10 years now.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Very interesting. So again, it seemed like this unlikely situation of being a part-time receiving clerk presented an opportunity for your kind of, your leadership skills and your organizational mindset and prowess. It gave these things an outlet. Like you now could, hey, like I can create systems to make this more efficient for everyone involved. And it sounds like it was noticed by the higher up folks, and you were promoted as a result, made full-time and then promoted. What I think is so interesting, and the reason that I describe this idea of self-knowledge, self-awareness, figuring out and understanding who it is that you are, that we are, I really do believe it, as long as you're breathing, it never stops. And the reason for that in part is because whatever strengths we have naturally may or may not be given opportunities to shine by our environments. There are other strengths or skills that we can learn. And even though we might not have the most natural aptitude for them, we can overcome that in a lot of different ways through desire, through interest, and sometimes even necessity. But oftentimes we don't even discover things about ourselves until we're in a situation that presents the opportunity to do so. And I find that so endlessly interesting, both in my own life experience and when I hear other people's stories of how they become who they are and become who they, grow into. So during the course of your time at the aerospace company, did you apply this sort of entrepreneur mentality throughout your tenure there, would you say?
Yes, definitely did. Through and through. I mean, every chance I got, I was looking to improve things, to grow things. Before I'd gotten there, I believe the company had been around 30 years or 33 years, or sorry, 23 years, I think is what it was when I got there, something along those lines. So there was some things that just, you start a business and you don't ever like go back to it, but it was time to kind of go back to those things. And I was kind of the guy who was willing to open that box, if you will. And
they were receptive, because not all companies would be, right?
Initially, I think I approached that wrong. I'm not going to say I never got written up in this job, by the way. So it wasn't all great years. I think I was always one of the impact players, one of the key players in the organization. But there was times people were like, "Yo, Alex, slow down, stop. Like, we're not doing that right now." And I had to learn to be tame in corporate, if you will, right?
Well, often the larger the company is, but some of it also has to do with the culture, of course, can suffocate those sorts of, or at least stifle and slow down any sort of ideas about radically changing the SOP, as it were, the standard operating procedure, right? Which is a term I know you like.
Yeah.
So did you feel it all stifled or suffocated? The entrepreneurial Alex, did he feel, too contained by this structure, or was there a point where you felt you needed to be released and free, or did you feel, like for a while, like that this satisfied this sort of entrepreneur existence with a steady paycheck and everything, did it satisfy those aspects of your personality? And if this changed, at what point did you feel that start to change?
Yeah, Eric, if you're okay with that, I'd like to give a disclaimer before I answer.
Yeah,
one, if
please.
That's all right. So I was there for 15 years total. And I want to quickly mention the last year I was there was my best year I had. I left the company on very good terms. I always say, like, the way you end one season is the way you begin the next. So I wanted to end in a really good way so I could start my next season in a really good way. As a matter of fact, a year after I left the company, they asked me to come back to speak at another senior person's, they were retiring. They asked me to come speak at it. So like I left on very good terms. So I want to make sure that when I'm out to share, people aren't like, oh, he was probably slacking off and he finally was just like, I'm out of here. That never happened. I can say with confidence, like I ended that season strong. And if I was to call them today, I don't know if they have a position for me, but I know I'd be welcome back if there was something available. So that's my disclaimer I want to share real quick, because I want people to understand that like I put 110% until the day I was gone. And again, I believe the way you end that season is the way you start the next. So I always encourage people, like, a little learning lesson in here, like make sure that you're faithful till the end with whatever it is that you're doing. Like finish strong before you move into the next thing. That's my disclaimer there. And I'll mention that because the company, like I said, it started with like low millions and worked its way into like this giant organization. It was kind of hyper growth. So especially the first 10 to 12 years, I felt like I could flex as an entrepreneur all I wanted, like, because it was growing so fast. People were like, yeah, what's your idea? Yeah, can you fix the structure here? Can we this is broken next. Let's go over here, right? And I went through during, especially, I think it was the first 12 years. It was first 12 years. I went through and I must have worked in every department, not because they couldn't find a fit, but I kind of build a system, replace something, like replace myself, move to another one, which is, I believe it's just the way I'm wired. So I worked my way up by doing that. And because of that, every time I got promoted or moved to a new position, I was very valuable, because it was like, oh, well, we can't do this because I know this side of the company, XYZ needs to happen. And that's why this won't work like this. I had this baseline knowledge that just people who were coming to the organization didn't really have, because they didn't work in all the positions, if you will.
And what an education to have your hand in all those different areas, right?
So thankful for it. Yeah. I mean, to me, no one's more valuable than the person who starts at the bottom of an organization and works their way through it, because they've just seen it all. And as long as they can remember where they came from, of this is why we do this, because it's going to really hurt this person's job, right? Like, anyway, I digress. Really important. But year 12 is when the company went public. So we had this huge buyout. We went public. And helping with that process, even, that was super fun. It was a bit more corporate than I'd like, I'll be honest, but it was a very fun experience understanding how a merger goes and like how the taxes work. I found that very interesting, but I'll never forget it. This was probably the beginning of year 13. At this point, I was in my executive role, which was director of commercial operations. Basically, I was in charge of the company's profit margins and our processes. Like, surprise, surprise, right? With what we've been sharing. It's kind of just like
same thing you were doing since you were 10.
Right, exactly. And I remember at one point in one of our divisions of the company, we saved a full 10%. Like it was like 10 or 11%, somewhere between there. And it was like, that's huge at a company that size. So in my head, this is not actually happened. I walked down to my CEO's office, which is just down the hall from mine, kicked the door in. Again, I didn't actually do it in my head. That's what I was doing because I was so excited. Sat down at his desk, put my feet up on it. Again, in my head, that didn't actually happen. But I sat there respectfully, knocked on the door first, walked in, sat down. I was like, hey, did you see what we did? And he just goes, yeah, man, I did. And he said it in like a tone that was like not excited about it. And I kind of like leaned forward. I'm like, hey, we saved that 10.5%. Like you saw that, right? Like we didn't lose that. He's like, no, I know. And I was like, okay, what's wrong? And he goes, man, the shareholders are furious. He's like, we didn't say we were going to do that. They could have been selling stocks at way higher prices. They came in under because we made such a big move. And then I didn't say anything. I just sat there. And he goes, we can't do that again without talking about it and planning that out with the board. And I walked out of that office, closed the door, and it wasn't a long walk, but I'm going down the hall and just in my own head. And I realized, I'm like, you know what? That's it. I'm done. Like, I can't be here forever if I can't flex anymore, right? I can't do the things that I love to do. I don't want to become a cog in the system, even at the executive level. And at that point, I decided, you know what? Maybe I'm going to go back to this entrepreneurship thing. And I'll never forget, I went home to my wife and I was just like, man, like, I think I'm ready to move on. And again, this was year 12. I stayed for 15 years. So like there was I tried for a little bit, let's put it that way. But yeah, that was when that whole decision happened of, I think it's time to move on at this point.
Yeah. Inflection point for sure. I love those moments where we get clarity, even if we're not ready to act on that clarity immediately. We have those sometimes experiences in life that really make us clear about what's important and what's not to us at that time in our lives, right?
Yeah.
Now, you had said earlier in this discussion that an ambition that you had when you were younger was, hey, I'm going to make the Forbes 30 under 30. And you did, right?
I did not. Nope.
Oh, you did not? I thought you did.
Not. Nope. No.
Then forgive me on that. I wanted to hear how that came about.
Interestingly enough, I found out more now that I'm kind of in like more of a media role, right? Like us podcasters, like this is a form of media. Sure. A lot of things like Forbes 30 under 30 or 40 under 40, they're paid positions. And I didn't realize that initially. I thought that was something that you earned. You kind of earn it, but you have to pay to be the person who's featured. Yeah. And I got asked to be Forbes 40 under 40. And they said, hey, here's what it costs. And I respond with a video because I didn't want to like sound snarky or text, but I just said, hey, like, thank you so much for the consideration. Am I really Forbes under 40 if I have to pay for it? And I was like, I'm not against paying for things, but am I only Forbes 40 under 40 because I paid you for it, or did I actually earn it? And they couldn't give me a straight answer. And I was just like, you know what? It seems this is vanity. I'm like, I don't want to be that. Just, again, I have no problem paying for exposure and stuff like that. But I was just like, that feels sleazy. And I don't want to be going out there being like, look at me, when all I did was made a little bit more money than someone else and paid for it when they're probably more deserving of the award than I am. Anyway, I digress on that, but no, I never became 30 under 30 or 40 under 40. It has not happened.
Alex, I just now realized in you telling that story why I'm having you on this show. And I mean that seriously, because my impression of you and my experience of you that I have had as I've, entered the world of podcasting, and you're a big player in this world. And every experience that I've had of you, you come across as just a genuinely sincere, wanting to help, wanting to serve, good human. And that counts for a lot. And it's part of why I was interested in having you on this show. So for whatever that's worth, I like that about you, that you didn't want to be in the Forbes 40 under 40 if it meant you having to buy your way in, at least to some extent, right?
Yeah.
That's my kind of I like that.
Thank you. It means a lot. That means a lot coming from you, Eric. You've done a really good job in podcasting, and you've got a lot of experience. That coming from you, that really makes my day. Thank you.
Well, that story is way better than whatever I imagined you might share about how you got into the Forbes 30 under 30. So for my money anyway. So, okay. So you have this experience where you realize that in your work scenario, that the need to please the stockholders really supersedes any kind of innovation and ability for you to, strut your stuff, but also to actually help the company. And that was a clear moment for you where you realized, I need to do something else. Like, this is not me. And then you have this conversation with your wife. But then, as you mentioned, it was a few years before you actually made the leap. So I am personally very interested, and I'm sure listeners will be as well, to hear how you transitioned from full-time employee to full-time entrepreneur. Just run with that, wherever you want to go with that.
I'll talk about John Maxwell real quick. John C. Maxwell is a name that anybody in leadership is familiar with, and he talks a lot about failing. Actually, if you look at all of his books, the most common trend he talks about is failure or failing, right? Like, it's just, that's over and over again. And I just embrace that. I'll be real. If I wasn't as firm in a relationship with Jesus at that point in my life, it probably would have brought me back to the place of when I first accepted the aerospace part-time job, of being defeated. But I kept on failing. And it's interesting because I was like thriving in this corporate job. And I'm very thankful for that foundation. These were all side hustles I was doing on the side. You mentioned coaching earlier. I did a little bit of coaching because I was like, okay, I know a lot about building structures and I can help a company like to streamline process. I wasn't a good coach because I got so invested. I wanted to like jump ship and always be like, oh, cool, I'll just help you for free and we'll get it to where it needs to be. Like, I'm a helper at my core. I'm not made to be a coach. I had trouble with that boundary. And so that was a failed side hustle, right? And I did that for a little bit, and I now do a little bit of it now that I've grown up a little bit, right? But I decided to do a web design agency. I was like, I'm good at this. I knew how to build websites, so I did that. It takes one bad client to ruin that experience for you, and I was out, right? So like I tried that. I tried building a paid online community. I tried paid content, all kinds of things, and it was just failed after failed after failed after failed. But the thing is, what I learned from that is I was able to take each of the experiences with me. And I now have that as like additional knowledge outside of the corporate job. And again, I'm so thankful I had that foundation and have these side hustles going along the way. And I tried all kinds of things and just couldn't find it. And finally, Eric, I got this genius idea to start a podcast. And here's why I started a podcast. Because I decided if I can't figure out how to leave a 9-to-5 job, I'm going to talk to people that have figured it out and learn what they did. And I'm just going to share it. Might as well let the world hear it, because there's a podcast. They're not going to charge me for it. And there you go. And simply, that's
it gave
what
you
an
excuse to pick the brains of people who had done what you wanted to do.
Yep. And then not be like, cool, that'll be $1,000. Now I'm just like, it's an exchange. Give me your time. I'll blast it out on social media for you. And two things happened during this time. I learned how
wait, I'm sorry. The $1,000 thing.
Oh, if I was just going to call them up for coaching, if there was no podcast involved,
okay,
right?
I got you.
Like,
But here you could do it for free. Yeah,
exactly. That's a little pro tip for anybody out there who's really wanting to learn something. If you have a podcast, these coaches might be like, sure, I'll give you 45 minutes of my time instead of you paying the normal fee that I charge for that, right?
This was the birth of creating a brand.
Correct. Yep, that was the name of the show. Because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to create a brand. And if there's one thing I'm not really great at, it's like being super like, I don't know what to call it, like artistically creative, if you will, right? So like I couldn't come up with a fancy name. So I'm like, I'm going to call it Creating a Brand because it's about creating a brand. And the name did well. Anyway, worked out. But so two things happened during this time. I learned how to become an entrepreneur, but I also learned that I wanted it to be in podcasting because, man, as soon as I got into podcasting, I met people like you, Eric, and I got to hear incredible stories. An example, side note here, you had a conversation, I believe it was episode 7 of your show, the person you want to be with the piano man, Steve is what I think he goes by. Man, hearing, and everybody who's listening to this right now, go back to this same show, the person you want to be, go to episode 7 with piano man Steve and listen to his inspiring story, getting into the music industry. And I'm not going to tell you what instrument he prioritizes, but you can figure it out. But anyway, no, like I get to hear stuff like that. And I'm like, man, I want to be in on this industry. I love this. So I simply applied what I learned, how to become an entrepreneur, how to leave a 9-to-5 job successfully. And I applied it to where I wanted to be. And I found that podcasting niche, like that. I just knew that's where I wanted to be. And the rest was kind of history.
Okay. So I have a few questions.
I figured.
You talked about, there's some key words that I pulled from what you shared, and failure certainly is a huge one. I think that fear of failure is what stops many, many people from pursuing whatever dream they might have. And you said that for you, it was your faith that helped you rather than like take it on the cheek, as it were, take it on the chin, I should say, and feel beaten down by failure. Your faith gave you a certain strength in the way that you looked at your failure, or at least in maybe what the failure said about you or your belief in yourself. Could you talk a little bit more about that and maybe even compare, for instance, the way it felt when you went into debt with real estate investing and felt, I'm guessing, fairly low, and took this job as a receiving clerk because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but out of a certain amount of desperation.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's what
versus you're trying these things and you're doing them all on the side, by the way, which also I took careful note of. You hadn't left your corporate job yet. And I want to ask you about that too, but the way you describe these other ventures that you rifled through fairly quickly about things that you tried and quote unquote failed at, you said that you perceived this differently due to your faith. So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. And to put this really simply, and I'm glad that you kind of went there with this, is beforehand, I found my identity in my level of success or my leadership, if you will. But once I really like stepped into my faith, my identity I found in Christ, as I would say, like in Jesus. So what I was just a byproduct of decisions. It wasn't who I am at my core. At my core, I'm a follower of Jesus, someone who loves and serves. And that's still still to this day, that's my identity. That like that's the person I want to be, is that person that's more like Jesus. And because of that, these things were just things that were happening. They were part of the journey, and I just accepted them as being part of it. Now, I'm not going to say like I never even got the slice of it down. Obviously, I was always like, every time something would fail, it's upsetting, right? And you have a little bit of stress involved in it, but I didn't let it redefine my thinking. It's like fall 6 times, get up 7, right? Like it was one of those things I was able to do that because of my identity being the foundation of my identity being in my faith. And that's what really kept me coming back and just knowing, you know what, I'm going to get out of this. It's just a matter of finding the right thing.
Interesting. Okay. And then what made you decide that, I mean, this maybe sounds obvious, but why did you decide not to leave the full-time job while you were pursuing these other things? Because as an entrepreneur, it does require quite a lot out of a person, quite a lot of time, energy, money, whatever else, focus. And you did use the term side hustle. And that is a very practical thing for people to do if they're not ready, able, or willing to leave the security of a job and a steady paycheck. That the sort of common sense thing to do is to start a side hustle and see if you can get some leverage or traction. And if so, then at a certain point, make the calculated and quote unquote responsible decision to say, okay, I'm now ready to leave this for that. So what made you decide to not leave the job initially for about 3 years? And then what was the impetus when you finally felt that it was time to cut the cord?
Yeah, plain and simple with why I didn't leave. I don't have any kids or anything like that, but me and my wife were married, and she was actually an entrepreneur as well. And she was very early stages on a boutique business that she started. So she had an online business and storefront, which she later sold. But basically, she had a corporate job as well, and moving to an entrepreneurial role in my mind. And we had this conversation. I'm like, you know what, you go first, and then I'll go later. But we couldn't just both leave jobs. Like that would be, I think, maybe unwise at that point, like just financially as both kind of starting. We use some of the money to fund like a startup with physical product. Like there's some money that goes into that, right? So we just made the decision. I said, you go first, and let's get you really a firm foundation. I'd love to say I was smart enough back then to realize a side hustle was the smarter way to go anyway.
Well,
but it's just,
maybe not. Yeah.
Yeah. And at that point though, it was a necessity. It's all I had. And so while she was working on the business, because with anything retail, you work on the weekend, I would take a couple hours Saturday morning and Sunday morning or afternoon, whatever it was we decided to do. And I would work on the side hustle. I'd take one night of the week when she was going out with girls or something like that. And I would just kind of work on it whenever I could, type of thing, to figure out if I get anything to stick. Now, if I would have just left, I could have told you real fast what worked and didn't, right? It would just like speed up the process big time. But that was the decision we made as a family. My wife and I she's going to go first. She's going to work on her boutique, get it up to where it needs to go. And at some point, when that can sustain us, I'll leave and do my thing. And until then, I'll just work a little side hustle to see if I can get some sort of groundwork started, if you will.
I love that. So really, that's a story about partnership.
Yeah. Yep.
And, I love that. You're a team. You're in this together.
Still to this day, we still work together. Well, now we work. We didn't work together for a little bit. Wasn't interested in women's clothing. I'm just gonna be honest. But, okay, we work together full time now. So,
I'm looking at my notes, and in another interview that I heard you do, you were talking about the subject of failure, and that you gave a lot of credit to your wife for helping you kind of persevere and get to where you are now. And I know that she's helped in a number of ways. In fact, she, I believe, coined the name PodMatch, among other things.
She did. You're right.
Which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's our flagship product, and she came up with the name for it.
And we are definitely going to get into that. But I wanted to ask, I heard you say that you reached a point where you kind of questioned yourself and asked yourself, or kind of wondered, maybe I'm not an entrepreneur. And you were giving, is it Alicia or Alicia? Alicia, you were giving Alicia the credit for kind of helping you in that low moment. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, she's just always been a very good encourager when it comes to the things I'm doing. And for me, I look at something I did as like, oh man, this was a failed thing. And again, it wasn't changing my identity at this point, but like you get a little low about it, right? And she was really good about being like, oh, you'll have another idea. You're like, you got something else that you're going to do, and just reinforcing and encouraging me. And she's always held a lot of influence in my life, even before we were married, even when we were just friends. Like she had a lot of influence in me. And I don't know if that's always the same in every relationship or marriage. I'm very thankful it's that way, because for a lot of people, it's kind of like, yeah, whatever, she's just going to say that, right? But for me, it holds a lot of weight. Like still to this day, if she says something, it's gold in my book. And so she really helped me a lot. She's just encouraging along the way and challenging me to continue to go after things. And
was there a specific sort of failure story that precipitated that moment of self-doubt and questioning, or was it more an accumulation of failed efforts, or what? Do you remember?
An accumulation, I'd say. Yeah. And then like when PodMatch, our first company, did come into being, like I have a great story about how she really helped with that as well. But the rest of it's just kind of like day by day, journey by journey. Like I can't even tell you any like pivotal lines she said. I just know that like subconsciously, especially, that's always been very motivating to me and helped me out a lot.
So let's hear that story then about PodMatch and your wife.
Sure. Yeah, and this fast forwards a little bit. So like I finally obviously figured
first let's explain to listeners who may not be familiar with PodMatch.
Yeah, good idea.
What PodMatch is, how it came to be, and take it from there.
Yeah. So finally, a side hustle that ended up working was I again started the podcast, and I'll be real. I'm so thankful that creating a brand, my old show, did very well. So it got me on podcasting stages. And at this point, one of the side hustles I was doing was speaking. So I was traveling around speaking at events and stuff like that. And I liked it, which is funny. Going back to my high school days, I hated that. But now obviously there's still some anxiety when you're about to walk on a stage, but I love it. It's fun. And so I was doing all that, and I figured I want to be an entrepreneur in podcasting. And one conference I was at, Orlando, Florida. It was 2020 before things shut down. And there's about 2,000 people at this conference. When I got off stage, I just asked everyone who talked to me, they're all podcasters, what they were struggling with. And I heard a lot of things, but 100 people, I was writing it down, said the same thing. We're having trouble finding ideal guests for our show. And I just knew it. To become an entrepreneur, what I learned over creating a brand was you find an area of passion that you have, you find a problem they have, and you create a solution for that problem. And so I was like, here's my community, podcasting. The problem is they can't find guests. The solution is PodMatch, which, for lack of a better term, it works just like a dating app. Instead of connecting people for dates, it connects people for podcast interviews. So if you're going back to the Piano Man Steve, if you're someone who's in the musical industry and there's a podcast host who's looking for a musician with an interesting story, it's going to pair you together. And that works across all kinds of things. And that was the solution that we ended up building. And that's kind of like, that's what got me into full-time entrepreneurship, coming back to it, I should say, right? That's what got me there. And then Eric, how Alicia helped me with that. And this is like the one thing that like stands out as a story that I won't forget. The day that we launched, I had the idea for PodMatch on March 10th, 2020, and we launched into early beta June 15th, 2020. So it's pretty quick to get it from like idea to let's get something out there. And by September 2020, the writing was on the wall that I had to leave my corporate job if this was going to grow, because it was a direct, I realized the time I wasn't putting in the business was keeping it from growing. And the time I was at my corporate job, it was just, it wasn't going to work. They were both going to become full-time real quick. And I'll be real, Eric, I was nervous because I came home and I was like, hey, Alicia, I want to talk to you about PodMatch, this company we got going. She's like, all right. I was like, I think I have to leave my job. And she got really quiet for a minute, didn't say anything. And I didn't know what she was going to say. So I was just kind of like, I was legitimately like, my palms were sweating. And she goes, okay, I think that's a good idea. I trust you. I know that you're going to do really good with this. And I'll tell you what, like any lack of confidence I had after being in business for almost 15 years at this point, of thinking I could actually do something else and all these failed attempts, disappeared in that moment when she said, you've got this. Like, that's what I heard. And at that point, I was like, you know what? I could leave today. I'm ready to go now. Like, that was the extra motivation that I needed. Again, her words hold a lot of weight for me. So that really helped me out. But that was like a moment in my life that I'll never forget, when she just said, I've got your back. I'm here. You can do this. And that next week is when I put in my notice at work.
And the rest is history, as they say. So I have a lot of questions about, you launched this Creating a Brand podcast, and it was pretty successful. So this is before, I'm taking it that you were still working the corporate job while you were doing this. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And what was the frequency with which you were releasing episodes on Creating a Brand? Now, I understand that you rebranded Creating a Brand, and it's now the same show as Podcasting Made Simple. Is that right?
Correct. Yep. I'm all in on podcasting, if you all can't tell, right? So even my podcast is about podcasting, which, by the way, like, the person you want to be is really fun to describe to somebody who's like, oh, you have a podcast, what's it about? My podcast is not fun to describe to the average person, because I'm like, it's about podcasting. And they're like, your podcast is about podcasting? I'm like, yes, that's what it's about.
Hey, this is a freebie for you. If you want, you can call it the podcaster you want to be. That's
nice.
Yours if you want it.
I like it. Thank you. I was doing weekly is what I did. I committed to weekly, and the way I did
it's a lot while you've got a full-time job, right?
It is. I will say this. Again, kind of going back to what naturally I'm good at is the organization of something. So before I even launched, I had 13 episodes. So before launch date, I had that. So I knew worst case scenario, I've got this buffer. So I'm always gonna be pretty much good to go as long as I don't slack off for 13 weeks. And so yeah, I basically would batch interviews on a day I was planning on taking off anyway. And it's fun. I love these conversations, Eric, because this is like my favorite thing to do. So like, it's just a blast. So it wasn't like draining. I wasn't like, oh no, it's an interview day. Here we go.
No, I get it. I totally get it. Yeah. But there's also a lot, that said, there's also a lot of work that goes into and you take it seriously. And I'll tell you what, if anyone listening is even curious about becoming a podcaster, let alone interested in perhaps launching their own podcast, or maybe even already has done so, I want to recommend a video on YouTube, and it's on the name of the channel is PodPros. That's Alex's channel on YouTube. And there's a video that I watched recently, and it basically describes your process for releasing episodes. I have here Alex Sanfilippo's process for releasing episodes of the Creating a Brand podcast. This is a video on YouTube. You can easily find it if you look on the PodPros channel. And he goes into depth about his own SOP, standard operating procedure, for how he puts these episodes out. And I'll tell you, I was happy as I was listening to it, because I'm like, I do that with
Good.
some of the things,
Yeah.
not all of them. But it's you put so much intentional thought into this. And I can tell you clearly have, that this is a strength of yours, the systems part of you, but you have in place a system that allows you to keep up with a pretty breakneck pace of putting out and releasing episodes without, here's the key thing, without sacrificing the quality, because you take, much like I do, you take your interviews very, very seriously.
Oh,
I
yeah.
think you said in that video that you average about 30 hours before you even do the interview, just in terms of research and prep, reading the person's book or books, learning about them online, really knowing your subject and being prepared for the interview. 30 hours, that's before the interview. And as someone who does everything himself currently, I can tell you that there's many more hours involved after the interview.
The labor of love part of podcasting, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, wow. I mean, I don't want to totally lose my train of thought here, but that's an excellent resource.
Yeah, thanks for calling that out. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And it's a great example of what I love about everything that you do, Alex, in you provide, you're genuinely, you're not just it's not just words for you. You genuinely are about really genuinely wanting to help people and offering up helpful information. Everything is about being of service. And that's what I feel when I look at your content. If I'm listening to your podcast, your own podcast that you do, and you've had some amazing people. That was what my next question was. So you launched this Creating a Brand podcast, and you've gotten, I mean, Seth Godin, you've gotten James Altucher, Mike Michalowicz, you've gotten big name people on your podcast. How did you do that, especially before you were, particularly well-known or particularly established in the industry at that point?
I became really good at networking, I suppose. And I just would ask people who they know. And often people that were coming on my show, they had their own, and their last episode was with Mike, Seth, or any of these people, right? And I was like, hey, could you make an introduction? And usually it was a no, but occasionally it was a yes. Or sometimes it was just an outreach. And I did some cold outreach, and I used some hacks, if you will, air quotes there, some hacks that a lot of people wouldn't. Example, a lot of these bigger names, they get pitched to be on a lot of podcasts. But if I send them a video that's 30 seconds long saying, hey, would you like to be on the show? I guarantee you, at least in that week, I was the only person who sent a video. So it stands out. And I actually learned all that from James Altucher. You mentioned him. He has a book called Skip the Line, which is one of my favorite books. And it's just about basically doing something that other people aren't doing. You skip the line by if I'm the guy who makes a video and everyone else is doing text, I'm in my own category now, right? Even if it's a no, it's still, there's the one guy who sent a video, right? You're in your own category. And I just found creative ways to do that. And really, at the end of the day, I think it was kind of the early joy of podcasting. It was fun. I just didn't know how to do it, right? And now at this point, I have systems and frameworks for how to do that stuff. But initially, it was just cold outreach and me just trying all kinds of different things.
What a great share, and what a simple yet brilliant idea to distinguish yourself. And I know, for instance, that I've reached out to lots of people, and sometimes you get the yes and sometimes you don't. And I look at it personally, my own way of framing that is that it's a win just for making the ask. If I can go about it in as professional a manner as possible and be proud of how, not just the fact that I had the courage to get up the nerve to make the ask, but that I feel like I gave it my best effort. I really, that way I know I've done what I can do. I've done my share, and the rest isn't up to me. And I give myself credit just for having done that. But I hadn't thought to do what you just described, which is to send a video to make it that much more kind of unique and distinctive from all the other requests that people get piling in. But I will also say that you really never know until you try something. And sometimes you're surprised at, people's willingness to, say yes. You can't predict who's going to say yes, who's not. And, people have any number of reasons why they might not. But anyway, it's really a testament to your resourcefulness that you were able to get all of these, some and I'm not just saying that like the big name guests are the only ones that are worth listening to, because that's we both know that's not the case.
Yeah, definitely not.
But it is a reminder that, you know, don't rule things out for yourself. Have other people say no for you, but don't say no before you've tried is kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, I mean, you do not have because you do not ask. Simply stated. I remember asked one person, like, and I'll be real, like one of the things I validated when I was like working on PodMatch was the fact that I had a real struggle. Like I asked 50 people for every one who said yes. So it was a grind, right? But there's some people that I'm like, this guy's never going to come on the show. I'd send the email and 2 minutes later, it's like, sure, tell me when. I'm like, what? But at the end of the day, you don't have because you don't ask. Don't just assume that someone's going to say no. You might catch them at the right time. And there's a lot of tricks and hacks I could share there. I know that's not what this is about. Maybe one day we'll have a discussion around that. I'm open to sharing that stuff, but that'd be a later conversation. But there's a lot that you can do to like really, again, make it stand out a little bit.
Yeah, maybe that's a video for your channel that you can put out.
Yeah.
Okay, so just a couple more things before we wrap this up. And Alex, thank you so much just for your time, for your generosity, for doing this. I really appreciate it. And I know I've gotten a lot out of the conversation. I'm sure other listeners will as well. When you created this, you started this podcast called Creating a Brand because you wanted to learn how to do it. And you managed to pick the brains of people who really knew their stuff, and you learned from them. And you also grew an audience at the same time. And then you rebranded that same podcast and called it Podcasting Made Simple. What was the reason for the rebrand? Let's start there.
Yeah, the first reason was just my audience shifted. Like at that point, I was I was 8 months into PodMatch or something like that, or whatever it was. Again, those numbers all get fuzzy, but I was at some point into it. And I just realized when I started polling the Creating a Brand audience, the audience was growing. And I was very thankful for that. When I polled them, the entrepreneurs that wanted to start businesses weren't growing. They were podcasters that had quote unquote, like a business of some sort along with it. And so I realized I'm actually talking to podcasters now, just because that's my influence. That's where it's really growing. And it was a really tough decision to let Creating a Brand go. I loved it. I don't get to do really interviews like that anymore. And I will forever miss that. It was a beautiful thing. And one day maybe I'll go back to it. Who knows? But it was one of those things that I just knew, for lack of a better term, I'm going to call it a necessary ending. Yeah, there's a saying that what got you here won't get you there. So that show got me to where I was with being an entrepreneur, having that business, but it's not going to get me to that next phase. It was one of those things that, again, necessary ending. I had to let it go. And tough decision. The day I announced it, I got texts, I got calls, I got emails, social media message. I got everything of people being like, what are you doing? This is a hugely successful show. You're nuts. And people were like, I can't listen to it anymore. Now it's for podcast guests and podcast hosts. Like, that's not me. I'm not interested. And it was like, it was one of those things I was like, man, I know. I just think this is the right move. And at the end of the day, all you can do is think, hope, pray, right? And I'll share this. 9 months after that, I'm not one to look at my stats at all, but my show had grown by over 10x in that time.
Whoa.
So, and I didn't do any additional marketing. We weren't doing any paid advertising, nothing other than the fact that I made the right decision. I did prove that my influence had shifted away from people wanting to get into entrepreneurship, wanting to be an entrepreneur of their own, to people who wanted to be a podcast guest or host. And it just proved that I made that decision right. And numbers aren't always a pure reflection of it, but they definitely can be. In this case, it proved that I am making a bigger impact. I was getting more people reaching out, talking about how it served them than I ever had with Creating a Brand. It was a tough decision, but like I said, a necessary ending. And it was something I just had to come to terms with and do. And that's what made me do it.
Very interesting. So it sounds like you had this gut instinct that you could see your audience was changing and you wanted to go where the need was.
Yes.
At least the need of the audience that you had and that you were building. And so you shifted, even though it sounds like it was a little bit of a painful decision. And I'm guessing it would have been far too much work to just do both, start a new podcast. Or
that was my initial thought, by the way. Yes. But I'm all about intentionality, right? Like I said, like I'm not going to spread myself thin, and they would have become two separate wings, right? It would have been like, this is Alex's podcast and this is his business. I was like, you know what? If I give 110% just to podcasting, and obviously everyone who's listening to this has gotten this at this point, I'm like 110% podcasting guy. Like even my podcast is for podcasters, for crying out loud, right? So I just decided I'm going to go all in on this one thing. This is where I'm adding value. This is where I'm able to serve the most, and everything else has got to go. I don't have any side hustles anymore, right? Like all I'm doing is this one thing. And it was just, it was a tough decision. And like you said, initially, Eric, my thought was, I'm going to do both. And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm not going to do a good job. What is it?
Wow.
The man who chases two rabbits gets neither. Something like, there's a much prettier way to say that. But basically, when we go after two separate things, it's just neither are going to work.
Yeah, I love that. Maybe a little bit of maturity came into play in being able to make that difficult decision. So yeah, I want to just also tout podmatch.com if anyone is interested in podcasting, even just curious, or certainly if you already have an existing podcast, or if you would like to be on other people's podcasts. This is initially how I found PodMatch. I used it to appear as guest on a number of shows, and I made some great connections that way. Some really, just met some great human beings through doing it. So it's very interesting. I would be curious, Alex, maybe you've heard stories to this effect or not, but because you've brought so many people together, and I have no idea what those numbers are other than they must be pretty huge, but you have helped facilitate many, many, many podcast episodes that exist in the podcast sphere by linking guests and hosts together and allowing these conversations to take place. But what's happening also, at least, a certain percentage of the time, is that relationships are being formed and built between podcasters and podcast hosts. I eventually, even though I was using that service to find other people's podcasts to appear on, when I started my own, I have since managed to find a couple of my recent guests through the service as well by having a host profile. But what I'm wondering is, this is a long way of saying, what I'm wondering is, it's a matchmaking service of sorts, but I would not be the least bit surprised if real life matches and relationships and possibly even long-term, and maybe even marriages have come about. Have you heard any such stories resulting from people using PodMatch, of people meeting each other, and who knows what's happened?
Right. Well, first off, I'll share this. So podmatch.com, the homepage of it, I'm all about transparency. It actually tells you, I pulled it up while we were talking, how many people we have had interviews happen because of it. So I can tell that there has been just over 48,000 interviews, 75 of which were in the last 24 hours. And that's only the people that have actually logged it all the way through. So these are like confirmed, these episodes are out, which I'm super psyched about. That's like to me, a crazy number. Past that, it's been really cool because I know people, like one in particular in Jacksonville. He connected with another person who's on the platform, so he's in my city, and they built a 7-figure business together, which I was super psyched about. They met, and there's like a ton of stories like that. Maybe not all that size, right? That's a little bit of an outlier, if you will, but tons of people becoming business partners. I'll be real, Eric, I don't know anything about dating or marriage relationships. And I always say, like, people are like, oh, people are like, that'd be really cool if that happens. I'm like, I want no
responsibility.
No responsibility. I don't want someone emailing me in a year and being like, you introduced me to my wife and she left me. I don't want that. So
well, Alex, that is a testament to the work that you've done, but also there's a lesson in this about impact and ripple effects. And everything we do has an impact, if only on our immediate environment, the people that we're interacting with, but they then go into their next, whatever it is that they're doing, and they carry that into the next room with them, the impact you've just had on them. And so the impact that we have on each other is endless and it's immeasurable. We can't possibly track it. It's cool that you have these metrics to track certain elements of what has happened on PodMatch. But what I'm so, inspired by is this ability that each of us has through intentional behavior and decisions and choices that we make to really have an impact. It's so easy to feel like, what can I do, little old me? But everything we do, here's the thing, has an impact of some kind. Why not try to maximize it, be deliberate about it, and make it as positive as we can? We can't control all of the things, obviously. I just love, though, that as an inevitable result of this enterprise of yours, all of some expected things and many unexpected things that have come out of it. And I just want to throw back at you this amazing impact that you've already had and are continuing to have. And as the numbers are showing on a daily basis, each episode that is published, is in part because of this service that you've created and provided people, and likely would never have come about otherwise. So hats off to you on everything that you've done with PodMatch. And And hats off as well to Alicia behind the scenes, who I know also has done a tremendous amount to make everything that we're talking about possible. So I've not met her, but hats off to you, Alicia. And Alex, thank you so much. I want to just wrap this up by asking you, as you move forward on your journey, both with PodPros and life itself, what is it that you are looking forward to? Who is the person that you are continuously aspiring to be? What is next for you? What are you looking at doing or hoping for in the next chapter?
I'm going to start off by answer that by sharing a quote. What we do for ourselves dies with us, but what we do for others echoes into eternity. And for me, I know that what I want to do is become a greater person of service to others. Ultimately, the person I want to be, like I shared earlier, is more like Jesus, because I find Jesus to be that ultimate example of love and service toward others. And I've just done my best to model my life that way. So I want that to continue to grow, but I want to make sure that what I'm doing is leaving a lasting impact on somebody else's life, not just mine, not just my wife's or my business partner, right? Like I want it to make sure that it's really out there to serve somebody else. And I'm a big believer in doing for one person what you wish you could do for all. I'm never going to change the world, but I might change one life of somebody who goes on to change the world. And I'm very happy with that being the case. So for me, the person I want to be, once again, is just, I want to leave that impact on that one person's life I can help every single day, and just show up to really serve them. And podcasting right now is my vehicle. I don't know what it'll be in 5 years from now, but I'm just going to continue following the direction that my life has provided thus far. And I believe that God's kind of put in front of me, and I'm just going to keep on going. And when that door's open, I know it's the right one to go through. I'm going to go through it and just keep on chasing it.
I love that. And I know that listeners, no doubt, are going to have their own kind of inner compass and maybe their own religious or spiritual orientation. I know that I have heard the word God used as an acronym for good, orderly direction. So if nothing else, you can think of it that way, in terms of how do you decide what to do next, or, how to respond to what's happening to you in life. Alex, it's been a total delight connecting with you. Thank you again for doing this interview and for all of the great work that you're doing. I recommend that people go check out podmatch.com, the PodPros channel on YouTube, and anything else we've discussed that may be of interest to them. Thank you so much, and look forward to connecting with you again, Alex. Take good care of it.
Thank you for having me. This was really an honor to be here. I was so excited for it. So thanks again. And thanks everyone for checking this out and listening.